Hello, everybody. Let me get up. Let's see. Make sure everyone can hear me okay.
Can.
Okay, there's Saeldur. Jaerv, how's it going?
What up?
Oh my goodness. Okay, after it's been, I feel like 3 long months or 2 months. I can't remember the last time we done one of these, but welcome to Shadowword Podcast episode 3. This has been a long time coming, but hopefully we have quite a lot to talk about in this episode, so we'll do our best to get to it. So, kind of starting off, we're going to kind of kick off kind of what's happened the last couple of months. How's season 1 been as a Shadow Priest? We'll dive a little bit into what's happening on Tuesday with the new patch coming out. And then a lot of you guys actually submitted topics and questions for us, so we're going to have a bit to go through those. So before we get started, I'll introduce my guest formally. So with me I have Saeldur here today. How's it going, Saeldur?
Hello, it's going fine. I'm just here to chat Shadow.
Sailor is the mad genius when it comes to all the APL fun that's going on for next week, so we'll definitely have a lot to talk about there. And then, as always, we have our resident Shadow expert, Jaerv, who tells us when we do things a little too crazy. Jaerv, how's it going, man?
Hi.
That's Jaerv. Okay. Okay, so yeah, it's just the three of us. So we have kind of a wide breadth of experience between the three of us. But to kind of start us off, let's kind of talk about how season 1 has gone for a lot of us. So the expansion's been out for a little bit now. We've had enough to kind of dig into it, and I'll kind of start off first. I'll be the first to say it's been kind of a wild ride as a Shadow Priest in season 1. I think with next week's changes, it's our third round of changes after launch. Which has kept us quite busy. Overall though, I think I've been having fun, which is good. I think more in Mythic Plus than in raids, which we'll talk about in a second. But I think overall the spec is in an okay spot. I always wish it could be better, but at least I'm happy that they haven't given up. They are actively changing things still, which is good. I wish they would always do more, but yeah, I mean that's kind of I've been really, really busy, so we haven't done a lot of these podcasts or much just because of how crazy it's been. But yeah, overall, good so far. I'm really interested, though. I'll go to Jaerv next. Jaerv has been diligently raiding in the Race to World First, and unfortunately didn't really bring out the Shadow as much as I think he'd like to. But Jaerv, what are your thoughts on kind of how season 1 has gone, the race went, all that kind of stuff?
I think the biggest issue is that we lagged like 20% damage since we got into almost 10% buffs since the raid released. So I think that was like the biggest issue at the start of the expansion, at least.
It's just not doing enough single target, you mean? But
yeah.
Just in general? Because I think Council was okay, right? Or it was fine, but
yeah, it was passable like the first week on Council and kind of only Council.
Yeah.
But then, after the first round of changes, it was good enough to play in the Race to World First. But then Razagef showed his phase 1, so it was just bench after that.
Yeah, right. And you didn't play Shadow at all in the actual race, did you? Am I wrong?
I was in week 2 for a few bosses.
Okay.
Because we were planning on bringing Shadow on Razagef.
Yeah, and then we learned that boss is not Shadow friendly.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah, so I guess from your perspective, you think Shadow if we went back into the race now, you would have seen way more Shadow Priests, you think?
If they didn't have Razagef phase 1.
Okay, so yeah, still yeah. Well, you just get someone to carry us to victory, right?
Yeah, it's all about the last boss in the end. So you do every boss before that doesn't really matter. So you just kind of bring classes that are good enough to do the first 7,
right? So
that you can get gear for the last one.
Yeah, true. Yeah, so overall, kind of a rough tier for Shadow in terms of Race to World First. But I will say, kind of generic raid performance seems to be in a pretty healthy spot, at least right now. I haven't looked at statistics today, but we're reasonably competitive, especially if you look at range DPS, which is good. Yeah, I'll go to Saeldur next. Saeldur, how have you been season 1? I know you've been kind of doing a bit of raiding, a bit of M+. How's it been for you?
Well, I started the tier a bit late. I wasn't going to play this expansion, and I started playing with friends, and I was playing my lizard. It was an interesting start, to say the least, and then the first round of buffs happened for Shadow. I'm like, screw it, I'm just going to go back to playing some Shadow. It seems fine now. Yeah. And I came back and started playing it. So I think my priest is like 3 weeks old. It's a bit of a baby, but it's starting to do the damage.
Yeah, and you have really best in slot trinkets, so.
Yeah, I have an amazing ruby whelp. It's popping off.
Yeah, but don't use it. It's a trap.
Don't use it. It's so bad.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, anything else on kind of raids before we move on to kind of Mythic Plus, which I think was where a lot of people have things to talk about. But I think overall, anything else on raiding you guys want to hit on?
No, not right now.
Raid feels kind of fun. I mean, I've only done the first couple on Mythic and then the Heroic raid because I'm not raiding this year as well. I mean, Shadow is so bad and I just didn't feel it. So I'm just chilling on the bench and we just run the ult raid and I play the ult raid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think the raid itself is fine. It's just Razagath is a little...
It's just Razagath.
Yeah, Broodkeeper a little lame, but that's not really Shadow's problem. But all right, cool. So Mythic Plus, I think that's where we have a bit more interesting things to cover. So I think the first thing, and Jaerv is going to get this because he's been asking about it for a long time. Let's talk about Shadow and Mythic Plus, and specifically, kind of before we dive into some of the, let's say, controversy or some hot takes about it. I actually think Shadow's very competitive right now in Mythic Plus for damage. And it's even going to get better next week, which I think is kind of surprising. It's not something we've seen. You know, Shadow's always been decent, but I think this is one of the first tiers in a while where it's like clearly, you know, A or even S tier, especially if you're looking just at ranged. Obviously, ranged in general doesn't bring as much as melee always can in Mythic Plus, but overall, it's felt pretty dang good this season. I've done quite a bit of stuff on my priest. I know you guys both have as well. Yeah, Jaerv, how's Dungeons been for you? I guess because I mean we've had quite a lot of changes. No Searing Nightmare anymore. So how things have felt for you in Dungeons?
I think like the damage pattern of Shadow now is the best it's ever been in Dungeons, because you're actually viable on like burst. You have short cooldowns if you play DA. You have somewhat useful utility. You have PI. Like always before, you had these long ass void form gameplay, so you kind of had to always pull around the Shadow for him to do optimal damage.
Right.
But now it feels like you can kind of just plug in a Shadow Priest in any comp and it's doing good enough.
Yeah, I think in that sense I've also been kind of surprised at how well Dark Ascension has really fit in as a cooldown. I think a lot of us, probably including myself, were probably underusing Dark Ascension at the start. But I think the more you play with it, especially on Tyrannical, kind of to your point, it does give you that kind of like cooldown flexibility, which is nice if you are in a key where you either can't pull around Void Form, or maybe you just want like that, 3% or whatever single target damage. So yeah, been pretty good for sure.
Yeah, it's always hard to see like the full value of Dark Ascension because it's so dependent on your pull patterns.
Yeah.
If you assume like 8 targets or 4 targets, 5 minutes, then of course Void Form is gonna smash it. But
yeah, I think it's kind of like, you know, what you're looking for in a dungeon, and I think it's one of the benefits of the talent tree. I don't have too many great things to say about ours specifically, but one of the nice things about it is it does kind of let you build how you want to do your damage a bit more than I was expecting, in the sense that, yeah, do you want to be a 1 minute spec or the 2 minute spec, and you still have that PI regardless, but you know, giving you some like to basically smooth out your damage profile on a key, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, very interesting. I think utility-wise that you hit on, I think this season's actually really interesting utility-wise, because there are some keys where I actually feel like Shadow Priest or just Priest in general is really strong. So like for example, I think having that extra Priest on the last boss of Temple, Temple of the Jade Serpent, where you get the extra Mass Dispel, feels pretty huge, especially on Tyrannical. And there are some cases like that where Mass feels pretty great. Obviously, you mentioned PI. Are there other kind of utility things you've been surprised about that have been useful this tier, or is that just me?
Like Dominate Mind was good at the start, but then they like killed all the mobs, and now it's kind of dead. But
yeah,
it was useful in a couple of places.
There's a couple niche spots, I think. I don't know how. It's not super crazy though, as it used to be.
Like Saboteurs and not good and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And honestly, Fear has been better than I thought it would be.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
agreed.
We're not pulling 8 mobs for some. The dungeons just don't have to have us pulling 8 mobs right now, so we can just fear most casts and just stop them. Although there's a lot of dungeons that have mobs that aren't fearable, which is really obnoxious.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's a weird season in that regard because the pulls are kind of smaller and they're like I'd say deadlier on average, so you really can't you can't chain pull or chain pulling is like too inefficient just because they're maybe too spread apart. But yeah, I've also seen Fear get quite a lot of value. Like I've been even running that Fear CD reduction sometimes just because it feels nice. I wish it was uncapped. It being capped still feels pretty bad. I remember like Court of Stars Imps. I really wish we had like a competitive stop for that. Fear would be great, but it only works on the small pack, right?
Yeah, I have been using Fear on the Imps and it does work, but you kind of have to then single target stop 3 Imps.
Yeah, which is just
usually
like
kill one as well. It's a bit awkward.
Yeah, it's just a bit like it could be nicer. I've also seen I don't know how much you guys have experimented with this, but I feel like Mind Soothe has also been pretty cool. I do the cooldown's a little annoying, but that kind of the change to make it AoE has made for some interesting skips. So like I've done like on Halls of Valor, skipping those last sentinels and that pack at the end there before you go up the ramp with Mind Soothe, or just like kind of Fade in general has felt pretty useful with that. Or I don't know if you guys have seen on Court of Stars, after you kill the first boss, you can actually do like have a rogue go forward and skip all that RP and unlock the door for you. A Shadow Priest or a Priest can do that as well with Fade, which feels pretty sweet, which is something we obviously couldn't do in Legion the last time that was a Mythic Plus key, but that's been a pretty fun skip to be able to do as Fade. So I feel like utility's been kind of interesting this tier. Obviously, we're not like, we don't have an AoE stun. Our interrupt kind of sucks, right?
I think the biggest issue is that it's a lot of niche utility.
Yeah.
Like you can even make a case for like Power Life and Void Chest for healing.
Yeah.
But it's like you don't build a comp around it. It's just good when it's good, kind of.
Yeah, it's a lot of nice to have utility. Obviously, like Master Spells, like on Bursting, it is kind of that. But yeah, and then also like PI's range of value is like I've been doing some keys with like Rogue and Demon Hunter, which is like fine. I'll PI the Demon Hunter, like that works out. But I was doing some with Rogue and Windwalker, and I'm like, okay, where do I send PI? Like, neither of you guys want it.
Yeah, I think Shadow would be a lot better in like competitive keys or like MDI if the meta was more ranged focused. Like if you always played a Warlock or a Boomkin, then Shadow's value would also increase.
Yeah, and it's got to be partially because of the kick problem, right? To a certain extent, like just in general, like ability to CC mobs. Like it's kind of ridiculous how much CC melees can do, like relative to us. Obviously, they're playing in melee, but we don't have, like I said, an AoE stop outside of Scream, which is just 5 targets. And like Saeldur mentioned, there are some keys like Shadow Moon, I think, is the worst offender, where like mobs just can't be feared. So like we don't have that kind of like AoE stop that a lot of them have. Our kick is terrible, which is something we've talked about for a while. Yeah, I was really sad we didn't get not Shining Force. We never got in the class tree, which would have been great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know. It's hard because like we do have, I don't know. I feel like the PvP argument always comes up, but I feel like I guess for me, it just feels like it's slightly better than it has been. But yeah, to your point, like the quote optimal key group, you have 1 ranged and 2 melee basically.
Yeah.
And as long as that's true, I think it's still going to be hard to get into keys. Like even though Shadow's doing really good damage, can really help out your key, I think it's just a group that runs with 2 ranged is already kind of at a disadvantage, even if they do a lot of damage, Obviously key dependent, if you're running with a healer that has a kick, that also helps, but, it's a lot of things to kind of make up for it.
Yeah, the best pairing for us right now, I think, is probably an Enhancement Shaman to have the PI, because they're one of the few melee that scales really well. Their PI isn't incredible, but they're also just a really solid class in keys right now. The other options is Warriors are getting buffed next week. They might be potentially quite strong, and they scale pretty well at PI, especially in AoE.
I think Demon Hunter's decent as well.
It's not great, but it works.
It's fine. Like it's fine.
It's like
it's better
4%.
Better than Rogue. Yeah. Yeah.
Not much of a challenge though.
Yeah. Okay, so I think one question that we should cover is kind of the damage pattern of Shadow. So Jaerv, you already kind of mentioned that it feels better than it did before, right? Which is obviously like, like we're not relying on Searing Nightmare anymore, right? Which is good.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit more about kind of what that pattern is and what you like about it?
I mean, damage in dungeons has always been you need to have good on-demand, consistent damage.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't rely on a proc or a big ramp or like chain pulling all the time. That's kind of why Shadow has been bad in the past, like BFA,
Right.
Legion stuff. You have to like constantly pull all the time, and then you do damage after your cooldowns.
Right.
Now you can just go in like most other classes and just press your CDs and you do damage when you want to do damage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very, very valuable if you want to be like a good class in M+.
Yeah. It feels you're less restrictive than before as well. And like, while I think we're kind of struck a pretty good balance right now where like it feels good when we're in our cooldowns, but I don't feel useless without them. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
or at least as bad as it's been in the past. Obviously, you still want to be in your cooldowns, and I really think most of that is down to Psychic Link these days, really kind of bridging the gap between big bursts of like Mind Sear or whatever, or our cooldowns, and just having reliable AoE buttons from all our single target ones, right?
Yeah, and having the option to go Dark Ascension is helping a lot.
Surge of Darkness has just been genuinely a savior. My Spike Surge of Darkness has improved my key experience by like a factor of 5. Because I was not having a fun time in the first week or so because we hadn't had the buffs yet and we weren't really playing Spike.
Right.
Then I saw the buffs and I started playing it, and it made things like not good. With all the swirlies, just so much more playable. And then with the buffs, it started just doing generically just more damage.
Yeah, and my healer was mentioning this. He's like, man, it really feels like there are way more ground effects this expansion than before. And I was like, not really? I don't really notice them. And it's just because of surge procs. Like, you just kind of, like, having to move out because of, like, a swirly, to your point, feels less punishing. Or it's almost even not even punishing at all, right? With how good surge is with PL.
You just see a surge, you just see a swirl, you press the surge, and you slide to the side. Then you press Mind Sear again. It's great.
Yeah. Which is it's pretty unique, I'd say, from like a ranged DPS perspective. And maybe that's another reason why we don't see a lot of them, is just our ability to do that. Because it used to be, we had that while we're in Void form, right? With how often we press the Void Bolt. But Surge procs basically gives us that all the time. And because it's not an RPPM proc, we just have so many of them all the time in AoE.
Yeah, it's so nice.
Yeah. Even though a lot of people hate playing Surge or hate playing Mind Spike, I will say, for anyone watching or listening that hasn't tried Surge and Keys yet, you really should. It makes things so much better. I think playing without it versus playing with it is pretty night and day for me. The last thing to cover, or another thing to cover, is Shadow Crash. We haven't talked about that yet. Does anyone give their hot takes about how Shadow Crash feels right now?
I mean, it's good enough, but it's not as good as it can be.
Yeah.
Like, I think it should either be 20-second cooldown or hasted. Or like something where you can reduce the cooldown of it by interacting with the rest of your spec. But it needs a little bit of something.
I feel like it's almost perfect. You know, like it's like you're always like, oh crap, if only I had it here, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's still Shadow Crash. It's still a slow traveling projectile that feels awful to ever press. But
true. Yeah. Yeah. But it's like the entire reason we can do anything right now is having that ability to like instantly spread dots, or like, you know, in 1005 when and we can talk about the 1005 changes in a second, but when we're getting those new changes, being able to Shadow Crash and then quickly go into your burst with PL is going to be massive, right? Yeah, just wish it was hasted again. I don't know why they removed that. Or I guess I do know why, right? And I think, Saeldur, you brought this up in the past, but basically the reason, like one of the big reasons why Mental Decay is so strong is because of Shadow Crash's weird cooldown, right?
Yes. You need Mental Decay to bridge the 9-second gap between Shadow Crashes, because otherwise you end up casting Vampiric Touches still. You'll cast like half as many as you would normally have done without Shadow Crash, but there's still a lot of damage lost.
Yeah, so I think, and I'm guessing the reason why they haven't maybe fully pulled the trigger is if they did kind of buff Shadow Crash to be a 20-second cooldown or be hasted, or even give it 2 charges, it would kind of invalidate Mental Decay a little bit, at least on AoE, right?
Yeah. On AoE, you still kind of need unless they bid it actually to 20 seconds.
Yeah, right. I guess hasted wouldn't be quite enough.
Like, hasted is just not enough. 20 seconds is kind of absurd, though. You never have dot issues on single target or an AoE.
Yeah.
I think that's the actual reason why they haven't done it.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit? I think or one of you two, I think it was Saeldur, right? The idea of, like, adjusting Mental Decay to kind of solve this problem instead?
Yeah. The alternative to Mental Decay is instead of having it tied to Mind Sear and Mind Flay, is you tie it to Shadowy Apparitions instead. I did some quick napkin math, and we spawn just about enough spirit with our current rotation that it would extend to 30 seconds and therefore match up with Shadow Crash on single target. Yeah. On AoE, we make slightly more because we have increased insanity generation on AoE by a tiny smidge, but not much difference. It still doesn't quite fix the problem with Shadow Crash. They're still reliant on it. And on the packs where you have to throw 2 Shadow Crashes, it still feels awful, and that's what having 2 charges would do. Or like an alternative way of doing it. The problem with the tree layer is if you wanted to make Mental Decay just buff Shadow Crash, for example, they aren't linked. They're on separate parts of the tree, so it doesn't work. Like if like an ideal world, you had like a Shadow Crash and a talent below it that was Mental Decay, and instead of extending dots, it just reduces the cooldown on Shadow Crash by like a second every time it hits. That's probably too much, but you may have to increase the base cooldown on Shadow Crash to compensate. But that would then produce the same effect. But you can't do that with the way the tree layout is, so we can't have that. And that would be a better way of playing, in my opinion, than just making them extend. Because right now, the most thing that feels the worst is when you're fighting a trash pack and you can't Shadow Crash because the pack is dead in 10 seconds.
Yep.
But because the pack is dead in 10 seconds and your dots are falling off, you have to redot, but you kind of don't want to redot because the pack is dying.
Yeah, and then you have this awkward problem where you're just like, do you just spam VT, spam tab VT, which is like the classic problem that we've wanted to avoid, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it feels definitely could be improved for sure. And I think kind of along that note, the other thing to cover is, well, that's kind of what you do in these kind of crazy builds that don't take Mind Sear. So we should talk about somewhat the elephant in the room. I know all 3 of us have spent quite a lot of time testing builds that don't use Mind Sear, talking about why you shouldn't drop Mind Sear in keys and why it's, you should take Mind Sear in every key that you're doing. Jaerv, you want to take this first on kind of like your take on the no Mind Sear build?
Yeah, it's dog shit.
Yeah. Great, no, perfect, like great. Move on. That's all we need to say. Yeah.
Is in that kind of weird spot where it's good enough that you can take it if you want, but it's not the best.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people kind of missed that point. They think just because people at the top of Radar IO plays it, it has to be the best. But they don't really understand that those kind of players can play kind of any build they want in a 23-24 and still time the key. And at some point, you kind of can remove some overall damage just to fit a small niche, or because it handles the pulse better, or because you think it's more fun. But it's very hard to like prove that to the general player base. They just think, oh, they play it, so it has to be the best.
Yeah, and I think some of those players will be like, yeah, you know what? I'll lose overall damage if it's more fun to play. And like that's totally fine if that's what you want to do. Like any player can make that decision, right? Because I think Mind Sear is somewhat polarizing in that regard. A lot of people, for whatever reason, don't like it, just like they didn't like Searing Nightmare or whatever it was. But yeah, the struggle is that like Mind Sear and just like how you get it in the tree is just so easy that not having it for any pull that's more than, I'd say 4 targets and up, especially, is just like you're losing overall damage, right?
Yeah. I also think there's a lot of misinformation around the build. Like Some people say, "Oh, it gives me so much more prio damage. That's why I play it," but it doesn't really do it. Because if the pack lives longer than your dots, then you have to spend like 7 to 10 globals casting VT.
Yep.
And the globals you lose from that is less prio damage. Because you could have played exactly the same and only press Sear on Mind of Our Procs, or if you need to bridge the gap a little bit, a few seconds, and you would still do more prio damage. Like you can still cast DP, you can still prio, spike, blast, everything like that, and only use Sear to bridge the gap between Shadow Crashes, and you do more prio damage.
Yeah, talenting into Mindseer doesn't mean you can never press Devouring Plague in AoE. You know, like which will happen. Like if you're rolling up to a pack and for whatever reason, like maybe it got like super sanguine healed or whatever, and your group is like, okay, we need to focus this guy down or whatever it is, right? You can make that choice while still talenting into Mindseer, you know? It's just Mindseer's for the other pull or, you know, future pulls. So I think that's for sure a common problem where people are like, nope, you're talented into Mind Spike or Mindseer, that means you have to use it all the time. It's like, well, no. It's just the point is you have it for when you need it. So go ahead, Saeldur.
Here's the other thing about this build is everyone's calling it like the mindset or no mindset build. It shouldn't be the mindset or no mindset build because you should always take mindset no matter what.
Yes.
Just because the spell is so good to have the option to take it.
Yeah.
Unless you really, really, really need the utility in the top 8 points and you know that you won't really lose anything by taking mindset or not taking mindset. That is only true in like Shadowmoon Burial Grounds and Court of Stars where you can like drop it and your damage loss from not having it is minuscule because that's just how the dungeon works. However, you should always take it. Therefore, the difference is actually mental decay versus no mental decay.
Yeah.
And that is an interesting discussion point that is actually a valid discussion point, unlike the mindset versus no mindset thing.
Yeah, for sure.
The way that another thing that some people haven't worked out properly fully yet is the only reason why the build works is because you're abusing the fact that tags take time to pull trash packs. Because they take time to pull trash packs, you can cast your Vampiric Touches, the manual Vampiric Touches for a trash pack, before the mobs have been stacked. Because you're playing a Psychic Link build, they don't have to be stacked to start even doing damage.
Sure.
Which is very useful in some instances. Now, you combine that, and you can start doing damage and still have your Shadow Crash from midway through. And that basically gives you a 30-second rough window in which you can deal damage. And if the trash pack lives longer than that, you should not have played this build.
Yeah. So it's a controversial topic, I think, but yeah, to your point, there's not a reason to not take Mindseer. Right? Yeah. And also on top of that, it's getting buffed. Like Mindseer is actually getting buffed on Tuesday. For those of you guys that didn't know, so it's gonna get even worse.
I mean, there is one reason you don't like playing Mindseer.
Yeah,
that should be the only reason.
Yeah, which is totally fine. Like I think experimenting with builds and doing things like that, absolutely encourage it. But I think that the struggle is when people try to pass it off as Mindseer is better, no Mindseer is better. I think like calling a build competitive is one thing, but calling it better, that's kind of the sticking point, you know, for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, you should take Mindseer and keys. There's a giant post about it that I wrote up if you're curious about the full thoughts. But yeah, long story short, take Mindseer and keys if you want overall damage. That's kind of the TLDR. Thanks. Yeah, Jaerv linked in chat. Thank you. Anything else on the Mindseer take we want to cover? I think that's.
No, I mean you just play it always. Like the other thing is if you do play the build that hasn't got mana decay, please remember to cast your dots before you go into cooldowns because if you just Shadow Crash on pull and then try and do damage, you're going to find that your dots fall off in the middle of DA and you don't do any damage.
Yeah, and playing with, just to point it out, right? Like playing with Mindseer and Mental Decay is just easier to play. Just straight up, it's easier to play. It's harder to make mistakes than otherwise. So that like for the most players, you know, you definitely want to have it, in my opinion.
There's a counterpoint to that, which is if you're one of the people that finds it hard to focus on your buttons and the ground underneath your player, for example, or doing mechanics, the no Mindseer build can actually be better still for you because the only thing you have to care about is actually just maintaining your dots on the targets, which if you do the cast on one pull, which is okay, you can probably tab target your VT, and then the Shadow Crash in the middle, you can have your VT coverage pretty acceptably, and then your entire rotation is almost entirely instant. So if you're one of those people that finds it really hard to look at your player and your bars and everything like that, you can still actually perform better with the Varying Plague build without the Mind Sear. And that is what a lot of people have been finding. They're finding it more fun. They're finding it easier to play like that, despite the fact that it is actually mechanically harder to play because there's a dot extension to deal with. To deal with.
Yeah, true.
But they can perform better because of that.
Yeah, it's just hard. Like the overall damage, like there's at least a couple pulls in every dungeon that just has a giant pack to pull, or like a lot of ads that spawn, right? And like having Mind Sear there is crucial. Or to your point, like if the pack is living longer than 30 seconds, which does also happen. So
this is why it's also mainly a thing that you play on tyrannical weeks, because not only does it do more boss damage generically because you're a DA build, the packs don't live long because you're on tyrannical week. So they die in 20 to 30 seconds. Even on 24 keys, they die in about 30 seconds because if you don't get 24 key, your party members are also similarly skilled as you. You all do 200k plus DPS and it just dies.
Yep. Okay, but let's talk about next week, because this is where the things start to get interesting. So for those of you that don't know, I'll go over the kind of the changes that are coming with the patch 10.0.5 on Tuesday or Wednesday for you, depending on where you are. So there's kind of a couple main things for Shadow Priest specifically I'll bring up. The first one is Psychic Link. This is the big one. So they're adding more spells to Psychic Link in 10.05. Void Torrent, Void Bolt, and Mind Games are all being added to Psychic Link. This has pretty large build implications for kind of what you want to take in keys. Long story short, and we'll cover this in detail in a second, you'll be taking Void Torrent for basically every key for all types of affixes or whatever. So yeah, we'll get into those builds in a second. So that's the kind of first big change. Another change, relatively minor, although it is some single target. Halo, Divine Star, and Mind Games now all generate Insanity when you press them. Good news is, for those of you that don't like pressing more buttons, Divine Star and Halo, even though they do have Insanity, are still kind of break even to press on single target. So it's really not a case of like, oh, now you have an extra thing you have to press for damage. 2 targets up, obviously you still would want to use it for that, but at least now you're generating Insanity, which is particularly nice if you're using those 2 spells to heal anyways. And then 10 Insanity on Mind Games as well, which is great. The extra part about Mind Games, I think this is actually a lesser known change. It didn't get a whole lot of traction, but they've also added, I think the spell is called Manipulation, which is Mind Spike and Mind Blast reduce the cooldown of Mind Games for each cast. They've now also added Mind Flay cast to that. So you will be casting a few more Mind Games. I think it was like you get like 2 extra every 5 minutes or something. Like, it's not crazy, but it is something, I think is what it worked out to. My memory might be fuzzy. And there's a couple other smaller changes to like the class tree. So there's a choice node with Vampiric Embrace that's now just flat leech, which as Shadow we won't want to take, especially now because Vampiric Embrace is being taken off the GCD. So you can now press Vamp Embrace much more easily than we could before, which effectively means our kind of healing that we add to a group should go way up because it's easier to press the spell. It's not a DPS loss to do it anymore, right? So that's good. And then let's see, the other class tree changes. There's a choice node with the Psychic Scream cooldown reduction talent now that makes Psychic Scream mobs tremble and fear in place, so they don't like run away now. That's kind of fine. But yeah, I think, did I cover all the changes? I think that's
the leech node, I guess.
Yeah, the leech. Yeah, like I said, the leech node. So yeah, the leech node with Vampiric Embrace, like I said, it's a choice node for 3% leech, and then if you take Sandland, it gets added 2% more leech, so you get 5% leech total. Like I said, I think for Shadow, do you guys think of any reasons why we would take that? I mean, I feel like with VE being off the GCD, there's like, you should always take VE, I think, right?
No, because VE is a DPS increase.
Yeah. Wait, what?
Hallucinations.
Hallucinations. Yeah, you're getting 5. Yeah,
I'm about to go test that actually.
4
I'm assuming it still works. It should be 6.
6, right?
Yeah, they said that they never nerfed it, but they never.
Yeah,
so Vamp Embrace is 6 Insanity. Yeah, good point.
It's actually really nice for the DA opener because you have 49 Insanity unless you put a Mind Blast before DA.
Yeah, I have a feeling that might get changed.
Same.
Oh, also the other change that's worth noting to mention, so Void Mender's Shadow Gem. This is the kind of, quote, healing trinket that drops from Shadow Moon Burial Grounds. On the PTR was changed to be officially a DPS trinket. So for any of you guys that had gotten the trinket and like we're scared to upgrade it for Valor. It seems like they're kind of, leaning full into it being a DPS trinket now because it was working for so many of us as a DPS trinket. So that's pretty sweet. So for anyone that was hesitant about upgrading it, it's still a really good trinket. I mean, still top 3, top 5, depending on what you're doing. So pretty solid overall. And I think it's on our loot table now as well. I think someone checked that. I forget.
Someone said it was.
Yeah, it is on the Dungeon Journal.
Yeah, so theoretically, according to the Dungeon Journal, you don't have to swap to disc or hole anymore to drop it. Any DPS spec should have it on their loot table now. So
it should be very nice for the weekly vault next week. You won't have to ever go healer spec ever again.
Yeah. So that's the changes coming Tuesday. And obviously, like we mentioned, this is going to have some kind of build implications. The good news for those of you that are kind of in like more of a rating mindset, as far as rating builds are concerned, not looking at very many changes. Where you will see changes are any places where you would have taken Psychic Link anyway, basically. So mainly that's going to be stuff like the Council Boss, maybe Broodkeeper if you were kind of full on the ad group. But those are kind of the main changes. Jaerv, I don't know if there's anything else you had in mind of kind of what we're expecting to see change. Maybe Kurog Mythic or something.
I think it's mostly going to be like parsing talents.
Yeah.
Like you slot in Psychic Link on Daphia or Aeronog or
Senarth or something.
Broodkeeper, stuff like that.
But yeah, to your point, more parsing, not for progging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we won't see too much there. Now, what is changing quite heavily is our dungeon builds. So kind of the largest change here is Void Torrent is massive. Saeldur, I don't know if you want to talk about kind of the work that you've done just to looking at Void Torrent's damage, but it's pretty crazy.
So Void Torrent is a very fun spell. It's not actually that fun to press, sadly, because it feels a bit slow. It's the only comment I'll have on it. And after testing it on PTR a bit this morning, I've also noticed that you're just really busy in Void Eruption now. Like, if you're playing Void Eruption specifically, you haven't got time to press most spells. You're really busy. So that feels a bit awkward, but I mean, it fits and it's fine, and you can get a cast. But there's a couple of competing versions of the build. So there's ones that take Malediction, which is a talent that decreases the cooldown on Void Torrent, which makes it a 30-second cooldown from a minute with 2 ranks. Then the other versions just don't upgrade that. They don't take Malediction, you just get a minute torrent. But these ones feel easier to play, because it's a lot easier to fit 1 torrent in rather than 2. But the specific build that ends up being better is probably going to be dungeon dependent, and also possibly preference. The difference is not really going to be that much. Other than single target, the Cthulhu builds do more damage on single target with the 1 rank and Void Torrent. So, with that said, how much damage does the Void Torrent deal? The answer is about 10% of your overall.
That's pretty crazy.
From Void Torrent alone.
Is that including the Psychic Link portion?
Yeah, including the Psychic Link portion. It's about 10% of your overall coming from a single spell.
It's pretty crazy.
And that's you just press it every pack. You can just Void Torrent every pack if you take the talent that upgrades it.
Yeah, and really what it comes down to is when do you take Malediction, right? Because when you invest that many points into the bottom right section of our tree, then this is where the Idol of N'Zoth meme comes into play. So
it's about 7% without taking the upgrades. So it's about 7% with no upgrades, and then 10 or a bit higher if you take the upgrades. Let me switch to a Dungeon Slice sim. The Dungeon Slice is a meme, but we'll get to that later in the podcast. But it's still useful in this case because it works a bit better than Dungeon Root still, and it provides an okay summary-ish. We'll get to that later. Yeah. But point still stands. Void Torrent good, but a lot of the damage is not coming from Void Torrent. It's actually coming from the other spells on Psychic Link. Pop, go.
Yeah, so Mind Games and Void Bolt are also being added to Psychic Link. So Psychic Link's breakdown in your keys is going to be going. It's going to be changing. But as we already mentioned before, some of the other changes that are also coming with 10.05, I forgot to highlight, are the bug fixes. So we do have 2 important bug fixes to note for kind of this new damage pattern that we're talking about. The first one is with Coalescing Shadows. So this is that node in the top portion of the tree that you always take. Some people call it Shadow Orbs, whatever you want to say. That has a component to it. When you actually consume the Coalescing Shadows, you get a buff that increases the damage of your periodic spells by 10%. As some of you may already know, periodic spells include things like dots, but it also includes our kind of channeled spells like Mind Flay, Void Torrent. Notably, this bug has been here since beta. That has not been buffing Mind Sear damage. And this actual periodic spell damage, does it last 15 seconds, 10 seconds? I feel like it's 15.
Yeah.
Something like that.
No,
It lasts quite
15.
a long time. 15, yeah. So your uptime of this is actually pretty long. So it effectively means starting on Tuesday, Mindseer will be doing roughly 10% more damage all the time, which is pretty sweet. Does kind of hurt, now the conversation is about like when do you stop pressing Mindseer or whatever from an overall damage perspective, which we can cover if we have time. But yeah, and then the other change, which is also really exciting to see, no, it's not the Screams bug, that thing is still bugged, is with Ancient Madness. So if you weren't aware, Ancient Madness, which is the crit after you press Void Eruption or Dark Ascension, you were actually losing double the amount of crit that you were supposed to per second. So you're going from the 20% crit all the way down to 0% in the first 10 seconds of Void Form, which is pretty bad. So they've now corrected that bug, and now you're going from 20 to 0 in 20 seconds, as expected. So effectively, Ancient Madness is now working on Void Eruption. I think like practically the Ancient Madness one isn't doing like a whole lot in terms of like builds. Like we already mentioned, raid builds aren't really changing, although the gap between Dark Ascension and Void Form is a bit closer now. I think it's still around that like 1% mark, but yeah, pretty close. So yeah, what this looks like in dungeons, we're still going to be taking Idol of Yogg-Saron all the time. So you basically, our builds are somewhat cookie cutter. You always pick Yogg-Saron, you always pick Mindflay Insanity. They're just too much. That just makes sense. And then you always pick Void Torrent now. And that's going to be kind of our base build for keys, is Yogg-Saron, MFI, Void Torrent. Obviously, you can pick DA or Void Form depending on the key and depending on what you want to do. And then the choice comes into, well, where do you want to fill the rest of the tree out with your points? The two main builds are either you fill it out with Cthulhu, Idol of Cthulhu, or Idol of N'Zoth. And it's going to be a bit key dependent, like Saeldur mentioned. We're still kind of testing. Obviously, we only have these changes on PTR, but I'm expecting the Cthulhu build to be the more kind of generic purpose one. And then N'Zoth will be kind of the more, no, I actually want to do more AoE damage. You lose out on more single target, but yeah. So that's like the long and the short of the builds. Obviously very, very overview. And someone was asking in chat, very good point. Idol of Y'Sharj is somewhat not used anymore. Along with Inescapable Torment and Mindbender are all kind of going away for keys.
We don't have points for them.
Yeah, we just don't have points. Unfortunately, it's just not possible to take Void Torrent, Yogg-Saron, MFI, and Mindbender. You just can't have all of that at once in a tree. Unless you start dropping points from like maybe even going like a one idol build or something. We just have all these points that we want, and they're just very spread out in the tree. And it turns out, running double idol builds is always the play. Generally, dropping an idol just doesn't make sense from like an overall damage perspective. Although we did test running, Saeldur had me kind of madman experimenting with, do you drop idols completely? And turns out the answer is no, you don't. So I know a lot of people are kind of excited maybe to not play with Inescapable Torment anymore. But yeah, Jaerv, Saeldur, did I miss anything? I think that's like the surface of the changes.
Yeah,
that's kind of it.
That's good.
I mean, other stuff is rotation priority doesn't really change. The other thing is it's still basically the same as we're playing with. You just have better filler spells in a depressing way. That includes Void Torrent. That's just a better filler spell.
Yeah, it's massive.
It's just a really, really strong one. Because the priority on clearing things like Mind Blast is still more important than using a Void Torrent, because Mind Blasts are just that good because of Mind Devour, for example. And they also make Yoke. Like, the Spirit, the damage, the PL, everything combined just makes Mind Blast more important. So you don't ever want to really cap charges.
Yeah.
Which is what makes I said earlier, this is what makes the Void Eruption really weird. Because you kind of want to like lower all your blast charges, not ever cap Insanity, and then press Torrent without wasting much. But it's fine. You get it within like 5-10 seconds normally of pressing Void Torrent reduction.
Yeah. And then Mind Games as well, right? I mean, Mind Games is
Mind Games
massive now.
Makes Insanity too. It's really good.
Yeah. So and which is kind of interesting. I know one of you guys wrote this in our notes here, but for those of you that haven't tried it, taking Power Word Life is actually really strong in some keys. As like if you're comfortable kind of being that like hybrid DPS healer if you want for your group when the group needs it, or when you just need to heal, honestly. But now you kind of need to take all the upgraded Mind Games nodes because it is quite a lot of damage with Psychic Link now, and like we mentioned, getting reduced now with those Mind Flake casts as well, right? So
yeah. You still can do it, but it just lowers the other utility that you can take in a key, defensive utility primarily. And because I was taking Power Life mainly as a defensive tool for myself, plus the mechanics on high keys put you down to Power Life range, and you just quickly powered life yourself back up to full HP nearly. That's a shame, because I'd rather most likely upgrade Desperate Prayer, for example, and just live.
Yep. But yeah, and really the whole method behind all of the testing that we've been doing, which is a metric crap ton. Like, I've been living inside of SimC just testing all these crazy builds, is really just about point efficiency, right? And insofar as if you just went down the tree and you're like, I'm going to pick the things that look the best on the DPS meter, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be point efficient, which is kind of the whole problem with the tree, I think, right now, in that, like, Idol of Yogg-Saron is just really point efficient because of how strong Mind Devourer is. Like, not taking Mind Devourer, like, isn't an option. Or what's the node right above Mind Devourer that I forget? Encroaching Shadows?
Encroaching Shadows, yeah.
Encroaching Shadows is massive. Like, you always have to take it. So it's just kind of a matter of, like, when you're already investing all those points and then Yogg is just 1 point away, it's like, oh, it's point efficient, you should take it, right? That's kind of a similar problem with other parts of our build and kind of where we're at. So, yeah. And then as far as... So someone else brought up a good point. So I don't know, Jaerv, if you have a take on this about kind of where the Void Form versus Dark Ascension is going to play in keys with the new patch, now that, you know, Void Bolt is considerably better in AoE.
I think you're going to play Void Form in most of the keys. Like, I still don't see it in, like, Court of Stars.
Mm-hmm.
But if you start going, like, Halt of Valor, Azure Vault, Temple, stuff like that, I think you always play Void Eruption, unless it's, like, very specific build patterns.
Yeah, especially Fortified Weeks, right? I mean, obviously, like, you do get that small boost to single target with Dark Ascension, but yeah, to your point, you know, that's really just a few dungeons, right?
Yeah, if you compare it, like, now, we kind of play it in 2 dungeons, but next week I think you're going to play it in, like, 85% of the dungeons instead.
Yeah.
The other thing to think about is not, is DA good? It's more, will I get full value from Void Form? So it's, Void Form is, the way it works and extends, normally at least 40 seconds. You normally get 50, nearly even 60 quite often. Getting more than that is extremely rare, but it's possible on things like Council. But if you can't get that full value from the Void Form, it really, really tapers off very quickly. And that's important in places like Knockwood, where you can actually kill 2 packs in 1 Void Form sometimes.
Yeah.
If the tank is really fast because you have the dragons, and you kill a pack cleanly at the same time, you can fly to the next pack and land in Shadow Crash and start doing damage, and actually kill 2 packs in 1 Void Form. You get so much value if you're 1 cooldown.
For
but
sure.
If packs are only living 20 seconds, Void Form is not actually that impressive. You should be playing Dark Ascension. But that falls back into pull patterns like Jaerv said, and it is going to be dungeon dependent, group dependent, and just affixes even.
Tank dependent.
Yeah, like, are you in a pug group, for example? Like,
yeah.
Pug groups notoriously just, you know, they play it really safe. They pull 1 pack at a time. They're very slow between packs, that kind of thing. That all of those things really, you know, they still hurt Void Form, right? Which is why Dark Ascension is such a competitive option for those people if you're in that situation. So, cool.
So the better the group, the more you're gonna play Void Form.
Basically, yeah. Sweet. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of 10.05 builds in a nutshell. We have lots of stuff kind of work in progress on all this stuff. So Icy Veins guides are already, like, all the updates are submitted. We'll have new pins out and all of the information about all the new builds. I'm going to post them all hopefully tomorrow, so you can kind of get everything ahead of time. The one caveat I'll make is everything is obviously still very much work in progress. So the reason why we were able to do all of this and kind of feel a bit confident about what we're doing is we've really drastically changed how you can now sim your character as a Shadow Priest. In the past, right, like, we've always, and this is still true to this day, right, simming dungeons is hard because every dungeon is different. Affixes change how you pull, like, the group can change things. just doing like a patchwork sim or like a 5-target 30-second sim, turning off lust and all that stuff. Like all of these things are just approximating damage in like very vacuum environments, but we've never had a good way of doing it for a whole key. And that has changed. We have kind of like the first iteration. I'm sure we'll come up with more improvements and things. But starting now, basically, you can now sim your Shadow Priest in a Mythic Plus environment, which is pretty cool. The way that works, if you like the really TLDR, you can take a route from Mythic Dungeon Tools that says, yep, you pull this pack with this one, then you go here, then you go here, do this boss here, and you take that entire sequence, and then you generate a sim C string for that entire dungeon. And then you can sim your character going through that dungeon. The hard part here is we had to write sim C, and Saeldur had to come up with these great ideas of how to use our cooldowns better so that that sim was useful. Right? When we first started, it was just kind of like YOLOing shadow crashes all over the place and like making very nonsense decisions about things. And now that's in a much better state to where you can sim and actually see differences between an Academy sim versus a Court of Stars sim, for example. And yeah, it's taken a lot of work. Like I said, still kind of like part one-ish, or I'm sure we'll continue improving on it. But yeah, so there'll be a guide out of like how to use that and how to do that coming out hopefully tomorrow or Tuesday. And yeah, hopefully makes it much easier or much more accurate to sim your character in those kinds of environments. Yeah, Sailor, did I miss anything, or do you want to cover any parts about that? I know I missed
one other thing is Dungeon Slice is still not ideal, but the changes we've made for specifically this new feature, which is called Dungeon Route, it's been in SimC for I think since near the end of season 2 or season 3 of last expansion. It's about a year.
Sure.
But it just hasn't been getting massively supported yet. But we've now started supporting it because our class is going to be good in keys, and so we've had some motivation to do it. But as a side effect of that, Dungeon Slice does work now.
It's fine.
It's not gospel. I wouldn't trust it. The dungeon routes, because you can tailor them to a dungeon, give way more interesting information and stuff like that. Like for example, we put in our builds into the dungeons and we looked at them. And for example, it recommends that we play Malediction inside of in Knockwood. Which is, I said that to Pub. I'm like, I probably want to play Malediction in Knockwood. It makes sense. We have the pull pattern that makes sense to pull 30-second point torrents.
Yep.
And the Sims agree. They don't perfectly agree. It's not actually the highest, I don't think it, but it was like 1% behind. And that's what we mean by APL version 1. We aren't quite sure if it's not actually better. We aren't quite sure if it's not playing right yet. But we are way more happy to say that it works. And it gives a lot better of a result than anything from the past. If you put your character through with the build that you want to play through, it will give out an answer that is a significantly better approximation of the dungeon, and you can use that to way more adequately just tailor your decisions. Like, should I be actually dropping my haste for stats? So like mastery, I drop my mastery for haste, or should I do that? I wouldn't fully trust that as a thing, and I wouldn't go out of my way to particularly massively manipulate my character's stats. I would still probably give a single target because that is the simplest and the most accurate thing we have right now. But especially for stuff like Trinket, recently they implemented what's it called? The new Trinket hub from Wider Boss.
Oh, Iceblood Death Snare or something?
Yeah, Iceblood Death Snare. Yeah. For example, that's an AoE trinket that doesn't do my single target. You can now put that on your character and run a dungeon sim and see how it works. Mm-hmm. And that result should be significantly more accurate than it has ever been able to get before. And you can see, should I actually run this trinket? And who knows, you might.
Yeah. So we're just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Is really, we're starting this. So tomorrow, whenever I'm still running the sims, they take quite a bit longer now because we are literally running a sim for every key on a +20 fortified and +20 tyrannical now, and now we're like kind of combining that all together. So the data in the charts is still going to be kind of iffy, but there is data for every single key if you actually want to go and say like, okay, how are trinkets performing in our kind of chart sims in like a Knockhood 20 tyrannical versus the Ruby Life Pool's 20 fortified, and kind of get like a vague breakdown of what you would expect. There are a couple of caveats to like kind of even just those sims. Like they're not going to match your details numbers exactly because of the way that details filters out the non-combat time. It should, however, be very identical to what you see in a Warcraft log of a key afterwards. They factor in combat time and downtime the same. But yeah, it's still early, but it's so far you can see like, oh yeah, in Academy our numbers are much higher than they are in Court of Stars, obviously. In terms of like overall key DPS, or like not good and things like that, right? So yeah, really exciting stuff. And yeah, and like I said, guides and posts are all telling me about this. I'm hoping I have time to put it out all tomorrow for folks to look at. So pretty sweet.
You still need the weak order, right?
Yeah, so with that to work, if you want to sim your own character in a dungeon route, like on raidbots.com or whatever, you have a couple options. You basically need to get a route generated. So you can either use our routes. So I've basically generated routes that are more or less like what an average plus 20 of each key would look like. And those are in the GitHub repo, so you can just copy those if you want. Or if you want to sim your own routes on your own like key level difficulty, you would still need the weak aura and then Mythic dungeon tools, sorry. Make a route and then export it to SimC that way. So yeah, so all of that will be posted in the Discord in the Shadow FAQ channel. When Icy Veins gets updated, it'll all be there as well. And it'll be pinned everywhere, all over the Discord. Like I said, hopefully tomorrow we'll have everything kind of coming out in its more official capacity. We just had to wait because it's pretty substantial changes, and we don't want to mislead any people to like, running Void Torrent today or until the buffs, right, in keys. So yeah, anything else on the kind of new dungeon sims you guys want to mention?
Oh, I guess I can mention it right now. And there's people that have been curious how much of a buff this is on AoE. It's about 26 to 27% buff on 4 targets. So for like Council, damage going up by about 27%.
Yeah.
He's lying, it's about 3%.
Shut up, Joe. Actually, yeah, it's about 3%. Please don't nerve us, Blizzard. Just because we're going to beat the chickens.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's pretty substantial. So okay, so we do have a lot of stuff to cover. I wish we had more time for questions, but we've already been going for an hour. So we have a lot of you guys that submitted questions for us in the Discord ahead of time. I'd like to cover a few of those if you guys are free to stay a bit longer. Let's see.
I have nothing.
You have okay.
Same.
Cool.
Just you, Bob.
Just me, I guess. I have dinner in a few hours, so we're fine. Okay, so first up, let's cover. I'm just gonna go down the list here. We picked out a few of these ahead of time. So Gondon in the Discord asked us 5 questions. We've already answered kind of part of these, but I'll kind of break this down first. So the first part is, are we happy with the current state of spells like Mind Games and Halo? I think in general, just covering the button bloat conversation. I'll go to Saeldur here first, because I know like just comparing Shadow right now to like what it was in Shadowlands, it does feel like we have quite a few more buttons that like aren't super meaningful, although they are changing that a little bit in 10.05. So how do you feel about just in general like button bloat in the spec right now?
Well, I think we have too many buttons, and it doesn't help a new player approaching the class because they all add a minuscule amount of damage each, but if you took them all away, would lose a significant amount of damage at the same time. Like, I think things like Halo, Mind Games, they're all, a couple of percent, like low, like less than 3 each in their relative scenario suppression, and that feels bad. I think the recent changes they just made to Mind Games and Halo helps a lot in making them feel like they're more useful, because they didn't feel that impressive when they didn't give us Insanity, because there's a whole feedback behind Insanity in our rotation and pressing buttons, and it just wasn't quite there. But with that, it helps a lot. Another thing to note is with the moving away from Shadowflame Prism, Inescapable Torment, for those that didn't know the previous name of the spell, we have less usage of things like Death in our rotation, which helps a bit. But we still have all of these spells. We're still pressing Deaths. We're still pressing all of the buttons, and we definitely have too many, at least compared to other classes. And then you add like our massive utility suite, which is also incredibly niche. We barely press any of it. We have too many buttons. It is true. And I don't know what they could do to make our gameplay better by removing them, because I like a lot of those buttons. I like having them when I want to press them. They're really nice to have in those specific scenarios. Stuff like Mind Games could go away. I mean, even Halo could go away. It's not really a big deal, but it just would feel bad to lose damage at this point. It does do a fairly sizable damage amount, especially when it now works with PO.
Yeah,
that makes my games.
Yeah, for sure. It's quite a lot. I think the other problem is that the base spec already has kind of a lot, especially if you're factoring things like Void Torrent or other kind of more active spells, or even if you're taking Malediction, you're even pressing that more often. But yeah, there's just a lot that you take all the time. So
that's not even talking about Mind Spike versus Flay. Just to quickly interrupt there.
Yeah, I mean that's probably the biggest problem, to be honest, is having two filler spells. I think it's really funny. I don't know if I told you guys, in my weak aura package, I made a weak aura to tell me which filler I should be pressing, because I kept forgetting what my talent build was, and like, oh yeah, I have, like I just like couldn't keep it straight of like when I use Surge procs over MFI based on my talents, or when I hardcast, all this stuff. It's like, especially if you're swapping talents between bosses and stuff, it's just been, it's rough. It feels unpolished for sure. So, yeah, and kind of related to other talents adding button bloat, I think the other interesting part of our talent tree is we have a lot of dead nodes, or I guess a handful of dead nodes. So Jaerv, I'll kind of throw this one over to you, but Gondon specifically mentions things like Pain of Death, Death Speaker, Whispers, Unfurling. Like, these are kind of talents that are almost never taken in PvE. Kind of thoughts of like why Blizzard hasn't just straight up like buffed these or removed them or changed them, or kind of thoughts on that.
I mean, I think you have to also remember that PvE is not the only part of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, some of those dead buttons or dead talents, like Unfurling, Pain of Death, Death Speaker, they are used in PvP.
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily have to buff them just so we can use them in PvE. Yeah. Because we already have a functioning talent tree for PvE. It's just that we don't use every single talent in the tree. But then, yeah, you can make that case for, like, Whispers, I guess. Because Whispers is just bad everywhere.
Yeah. And also, I think Whispers is probably the worst one, just because the other problem with Whispers is, like, specifically where like we're actually forced into taking Mind Melt if you want Void Torrent, right? Which, I wish there was another way down if that wasn't just Mind Melt, but yeah. So yeah, I do think it's surprising though that with all of the changes that we've seen for Shadow since launch, they really haven't done a whole lot of like targeted talent tuning, at least on the surface. They've like interestingly attacked it to where like they haven't just been aura buffing Shadow Priest, they've been singly buffing specific spells, right? Like the last round was like Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, Void Torrent, that kind of stuff. But it wasn't, notably, it was not just straight up Shadow gets 10% more spell power on all your spells, right?
Yeah.
Which means that it is kind of balancing the tree somewhat. So I know it wasn't part of the question, but Shadow or Death has not been buffed in the last couple of rounds, meaning anything that is using Shadow or Death is effectively nerfed relatively to the other things you could be pressing, right? Which is part of the reason why Inescapable Torment has seen kind of a decline in 10.05, or other various things like that, which is interesting. It's also the reason why Idol of N'Zoth is kind of a thing sometimes in 10.05. They didn't touch Idol of N'Zoth at all. They didn't buff it. They didn't, it's still the same, but they did effectively buff the nodes around it. So yeah, it's interesting the way that they're choosing to do it, for sure.
Yeah, I think another issue is, someone mentioned it, we have a lot of forced utility in our Spectre still. Like, you have to take 2 to 3 points in utility, which makes some of the damage nodes kind of, like, you have to push them to the side a little bit. Like, if you didn't have to take Dispersion, you didn't have to take Silence, then you could, like, split up the tree a little bit more, remove some 2-point node, and then use most of the talents. Like, if Whispers was just free, then it wouldn't be terrible to take.
Sure, but the fact that
it competes, it competes with all the other shit now.
Well, and it also doesn't help that, like, the top of our tree is, like, as you get into the damaging buttons, Coalescing Shadows, Mind Sear, and Mind Spike, you take them all the time in dungeons, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is the other problem, like, especially that kind of left-hand side of the tree, or, like, Coalescing Shadows and, Mind Spike and how good it is. It's like, well, I think, it kind of depends on how you look at it. Like, on one hand, it's nice because it makes figuring out the tree easier because you just always take these points. But on the other hand, it does make for a less exciting tree. So it's a challenging problem, for sure. Okay, skipping down. So, Chilby, am I saying that right in the Discord? Asked a point which we've talked about several times in the past, about the idle spells and how the idle spells don't really feel playstyle or rotation defining. And Sailor, I'll go to you on this one because I know we were talking about this, I think, just a couple days ago. But it's like even though our kind of idols of all the old god spells are very thematic, and I think a lot of people love them just because of the name and some of the visuals, they are not what I would call like capstone nodes, right? And they're kind of leave a lot to be desired.
Well, they're all boring. Just Idol of his charge is just the worst, probably, of all four, actually.
Yeah, probably.
You don't even notice what it does. It does do quite a lot of damage, technically, but it's the worst feeling one. Cthulhu is incredible. It's probably the best one of the four, because it has the best visuals, it has the best feeling. You can tell when it's out, you can tell when it's doing its job. But it also has like 4 bugs. Well, 2 actually, but
yeah. Oh, nice.
And those bugs are both lowering it in damage and propping it up at the same time. It's a really weird talent. But I'm not the biggest fan nor naysayer for Cthulhu. I think Cthulhu is actually fine. It does its job.
It's fine.
Yogg is fine as well, but it's also quite boring. It's effectively just a damage buff to spirits. People are always like, oh, I want spirits to do more damage. That is Yogg. Yogg's Thrown basically doubles your damage to spirits. That's what Yogg does.
I wish it wasn't bugged as well, but you know.
Yeah. It doesn't do cleave damage properly, which is why it does no damage in keys. It does like 4% in keys.
Or mastery damage.
It's awful, but
yeah,
it's still fine. It does a lot of damage, but it could have been so much more or so much like different. It's a delayed additional damage to shadowy apparitions, which means if you get like cut off on a raid fight at like 20 stacks, it also feels bad.
Yeah.
And then there's Nuzos. It's quite powerful when it's powerful, but because of the recent changes they made at the end of beta, it has a target cap on it, and it has damage scaling, and it has a bunch of negatives. Honestly, it would have been the most interesting one of them all, because it would have had the most interactions between talents, because it would have interacted with Screams of the Void and stuff like that. But it has a target cap of 4 maximum debuffs, and that just lowers the power of it by a long way. It's still good on 4 or 5 targets, though.
Which
that's where you play
thankfully,
it.
Season 1, there's not a whole lot of big target counts, but yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. It doesn't do much single target. It does pretty good AoE. But at the end of the day, they're still all boring. They could have been more. They could have been better. They could have been more exciting. Like, the numbers on them ends up being okay. They're between 5 and 10% roughly each in the specific niches.
Yeah.
And that's okay for a capstone, I'd say. But it's still a bit of a sour taste when you look at them. Especially because, we can get 2 of them, we can't get 3 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And when some of the nodes, like, for example, Screams of the Void, especially on single target with the bug, are, like, useless, basically, per point, and all of the power comes from Idol of Cthulhu, it makes the tree have weird layout issues, because you can't partially invest towards Idol of Cthulhu, you can only partially invest towards other things, and then we go back to point efficiency, and it ends up becoming, like, just take Yoxron in all scenarios. That's why we also take Yoxron in those scenarios.
Yeah, do you think part of the problem is the nodes right before them, right? Because I think, like, the power of, like, Inescapable Torment, Screams, and Mind Devourer is just kind of incredible, and, like, kind of, those are the more, like, rotation-defining points, So somewhat is hurting the layout, right? And that's kind of the whole point efficiency problem, right?
Yeah. Like, for example, Inescapable Torment's first point is quite weak, the second point is fairly strong, Mind Devourer is just busted, Screams of the Void is really good on AoE, but not on single target, but Idol of Cthulhu is literally 10% on single target. So it ends up just averaging out if you take all the 3 points, and it ends up being a really good increase, but can't take partials. Yeah. And that's just the bottom of the tree.
Jaerv, did you have anything to add on that, or like just kind of capstone feedback in general?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like they are not build defining. I think it's the biggest issue. You kind of just take them because you take the notes before.
Yeah, which maybe is the point. I guess like they've never really communicated to us like, how that was supposed to work out. Like we just kind of assumed like, oh, they have cool names and at the bottom of the tree they should be playstyle defining, but maybe that's just not their goal. I mean, we don't know, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's kind of. I want to hit this again because it's been asked a couple times in chat about kind of utility points. Also, kind of came from this question as well, but like, you know, how, and we were kind of complaining about like our utility right now is pretty niche. So Jaerv, like what kinds of things specifically, if you had to call out, would you like to see added or changed, either baseline to the spec or class tree, to kind of fit some of the, like fix some of those holes of utility? I know like someone mentioned, you know, balance druids are kind of fixing their solar beam problems in 10.05. What kinds of things would you like to see for Shadow?
Well, they aren't fixing. They're doing the Shadow for balance druids. They're just forcing it early in the tree, but
right,
not important. I think it depends on if you're looking at raid or M+. Like for raid, I think Shadow needs something that makes you want to bring a Shadow Priest and not a Priest.
Yeah. So like specifically you're saying like obviously Power Infusion's really powerful, Powered Fortitude necessary for raids, but those are all things you bring from a Holy or Disc Priest, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think
so right now you're kind of just hoping that you're tuned well so that you can be brought.
Yeah.
That's kind of the only reason.
Vamp Embrace kind of like, obviously Holy and Disc can technically get Vamp Embrace, but it's not actually a big healing CD until you put it in the hands of a Shadow Priest, right?
Yeah. It's just not good enough, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think there's like, what, 3 other Vamp Embraces in the game now? Like, Druids have it, Shamans have it. Yeah.
I think that's it.
Yeah. So it's just like, well, it's not like that crazy, right?
Yeah.
And those are better than ours because they have slightly smarter behavior than ours does.
Yeah, so what kinds of things would you say like you would like to see like Shadow get in that would make it be like, hey, we already have, and I think this actually applies to keys as well, of kind of saying like, hey, our group already has a healing priest. What do we get as a benefit from also bringing Shadow that isn't just another power infusion?
I think they need to give us something like Druids have. Like something that's very unique to Druids, like Roar or Typhoon or Vortex or something like that.
Like specifically to Shadow?
Yeah, like Black Hole, as we've talked about for like 3 expansions now. I think would be good. Maybe like a haste buff. Maybe like Vampiric Touch giving healers mana again. Like something unique that makes you want to bring a Shadow Priest.
Yeah, I'd like that. Or I was even thinking just like a raid-wide leech buff. I think actually, did monks get that in their class tree, or did that get scrapped? I forget.
Avoidance.
It's avoidance,
and it's, only to nearby players, but it's
okay.
Fixed and works now.
But yeah, something like that could be fun. But yeah. So as far as Mythic Plus goes, I guess, Sailor, are there some things that you wish that Shadow had in keys utility-wise that made it less of a niche pick and more of like a staple ranged class?
Having a good route, an AoE route would be nice, like the bomb, the black hole.
Okay.
Having another stop that doesn't cost us points is the biggest thing, I think. If we have horror, it feels fine right now.
Yeah.
But it costs us a damage node currently, and it feels awful.
Yep. And the damage node in the spec tree with Psychic Core even.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it does. So it feels like it's one of the. It goes back to the. I think someone else asked this in the questions we'll get to in a minute. That silence, why like having it in the class tree, and like it would be a lot better to have it in the class tree, because then we can just take the point that created the last word, or 2 silence in our tree, and it would feel a lot better. But as it stands right now, it costs us damage to get the extra stop, and that extra stop is so useful in so many dungeons.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why don't we have a Mind Bomb? Why don't we have Shining Force? Stuff like that. These are all extra buttons, though, and we had button bloat issues again, but we do need those stops. We don't have stops.
Yeah, so I think there are like quick fixes for that, right? Like, make Psychic Scream uncapped. Make Void Tendrils a ranged targeting spell, right? Like those are kind of actually pretty smart, like minor things that they could tweak that already that would do quite a lot already. And yeah, it feels like the community is like really at odds with Blizzard on like the silence point. I feel like we were kind of going at it on the forums between us and them a bit. Because yeah, like Priest is still the only class in the game that doesn't have an interrupt. Shadow gets it, but Holy and Disc don't have it. So like there's kind of a class problem there already, right?
Yeah. And a further point is, I also don't necessarily know if we actually do need a 24-second kick. It would be nice. But if we had other stops, like the Mind Bomb, So for example,
Mind bombs.
We wouldn't necessarily need our kick to be that insane. Like
Sure.
Boom King gets away with having Solar Beam, or he currently doesn't get away with not having a Solar Beam despite doing damage. But we could play without a better kick if that's what it needs to be in order to have other forms of utility.
The better
other things is they don't necessarily need to be in the class tree either. They could just be Shadow baseline. We could just you pick Shadow, you get Silence just for being a Shadow priest. The healers can still go get boned. Unlucky, I'm sorry. But I would like the healers to have kick too because it feels awful playing those. But this is not a healer podcast currently.
Yeah, true. It's not the Power Word podcast. It's only Shadow Word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. But they could easily shift that, or dispersion into baseline, for example. Like that would be another thing that would help feel better if they shifted dispersion into baseline, and that would free up points in the top part of the tree.
Yeah.
Because if you take Mindset and Spike, I think we mentioned this earlier, you can't take an upgraded Silence or defensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I think like the problem is it's not like we don't want to like the solar beam change as what was pointed out, right? Like we just want. You should never have to pick between damage and utility, right? That's Ian said this in a video or like some interview like before the expansion came out. Obviously, that's not totally how that worked out, right? Yeah, I would love for that to kind of be revisited. So, okay, let's see what other questions we have. Were there any of these that you guys really wanted to cover? I think we kind of hit the Mythic Plus utility. Let's see. Nina asked, so when it comes to Shadow design, what do you think it would take for something like BFA Shadow's playstyle to coexist with what we currently have? Interesting. Either of you two feel passionate enough to take this one?
Like I kind of talked about this a lot in the Discord as well. I don't think BFA or Legion Shadow would function that good in the current game. Like if they reworked the entire spec to only be that. But I think you could make a case for it if you made it a choice inside the tree. So instead of having like Dark Ascension versus current Void Eruption, you had some form of like short punchy Shadow with Dark Ascension, and you had long rampy Shadow with Void Form.
Yeah, but basically you're saying you want more identity into the... Well, I guess just take a step back. Both of those cooldowns don't really have much identity around them. They just kind of change, like, your damage pattern is slightly adjusted, right? And what you're kind of saying is the way you fix that is to, like, add identity back into the cooldowns, and you can kind of do that with these various BFA style with DA and maybe Legion style with Void Form kind of a thing.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is that it's a lot of work for Blizzard because they would have to like rework all our spenders. They would have to change talent based on what talent you have, change how certain spells function and stuff. So
yeah, I mean, the build your own Shadow Priest sounds great in theory, but it's a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
I feel like you can get a comfortable middle ground with how Void Form currently works. So that Void Form currently works by whenever you spend Insanity in bulks of 25, you get 1 second of Void Form. So a 50 Insanity from a Devouring Plague is 2 seconds of Void Form. This includes Mind Devourer not costing anything. It does give you as if you spent it. And if you combine that with ramping stats on the extension, so like every time you spend 25 Insanity, you gain a percentage haste for the rest of the cooldown, it would provide a bridged gap between the two. The problem is, in order to compensate for that level of damage increase provided by the ramping haste, like, because you would have to give a lot of ramping haste to make it feel impactful and therefore unique. Like, this is Void Form. The Void Form is ramping haste. You'd have to buff Dark Ascension basically to the moon. And as it stands, Dark Ascension just as a direct damage increase. It's very, very boring. And so they would need to basically work out an entirely new cooldown for us to be the other playstyle, to be the short bursty playstyle that somehow has the same level of power as a ramping Void Form that can potentially last nearly 2 minutes.
Yeah.
If you get lucky.
Yeah, but I think like really just, you know, with Void Form specifically, just you kind of need a reason to extend it right now that isn't just Mastery and Void Bolt, right? Yeah. Which I guess like is kind of buffed now that Void Bolt like cleaves, I guess a little bit. I don't know. It's just kind of lame, right?
It's really good in AoE.
Yeah. It's just
it's
lame. And then I think like Spirits, right? Like I think all three of us, you know, really want more Spirits gameplay, right?
Yeah.
But like they are kind of avoiding it. I think Sailor, you had the idea of like, even just as a start, like breaking out tormented spirits from the choice node. Talked about that in the past, right?
Breaking tormented spirits out and putting it somewhere. It's not very good on a single target, but it doesn't have to be good on a single target if it's not a choice node.
Yep. Yeah.
You just click the button and you'll gain a crap load of spirits on AoE, and therefore you'd probably take it in dungeons if you could take both. Especially because of what that would do for your resource economy. It would be basically it would be a better version of the node that gives you insanity currently, Maddening Touch. It would be a better version of Maddening Touch, and it would feel a lot better because spirits are better.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you wondering, Auspicious Spirits is you need that talent. You can't not take it, right, Saildur?
Yeah, I tried. I made him do some madman math, and not math, sims. It wasn't good.
Yeah,
when we take Psychic Link, we don't need technically to take it because we now get to Encroaching Shadow through Link. But still need it.
We've gone through lots of iterations on like the new builds and stuff for 10.05, and along the way, I think all of us have had this at some point where we're like, I wonder if we could, do this really crazy thing or like never take Auspicious Spirits talents. And nope, the answer is no. Jaerv and I were scared for a little bit.
I wish threatened.
Yeah.
Do these buffs kind of make you worry that they're going to nerf us again? That's a fun topic that I don't want to cover.
I'm going to smile and wave.
I'm going to smile and wave. I will say, like, the good news is that we kind of have the tools under our tool belt to, like, better figure out damage patterns for AoE now, which feels good, and, like, keys specifically. So, should they keep making changes, which I hope they do, like in general, like, I hope the changes we see in 10.0.5 are not the only thing that we're going to see, for the rest of the expansion. I'm sure they're not going to be, but yeah, good news is we have ways to work it out better than we did before. So,
even if they nerf,
finish Jaerv.
Even if they nerf Psychic Link, let's say we gain 20% damage from now until next week. If they nerf us so that we lose the 20% again, we're still going to be a better spec than we are now.
True.
Because we have better on-demand burst AoE from Mind Games, Void Bolt, and Void Torrent being on Psychic Link. So I wouldn't be that worried about nerfs as long as they don't aura nerf us so that it hurts our single target. But if they target nerf Psychic Link, it's still fine.
Should be fine. Yep.
So that's probably what I was about to go back to, because we mentioned earlier raid utility Jaerv, and I was going to point out that now we can do burst AoE in a raid environment, because primarily we don't have quite the burst AoE that some classes can do, such as like a warrior. If anyone's progging Monstercat Mythic right now and you've got a Fury warrior, check their intermission damage. Yeah, it's quite fast. There's a lot of damage, and that is a valid reason to bring a warrior. Currently, we're going to ignore the staying on the platform problem. So that's not a problem, Smile. But stuff like that helps us considerably by making us just a generically more well-rounded spec by being able to take Psychic Link, Void Torrent, and having that combination as an option, even if they have to nerf it slightly in order to bring us down in power to be more comparable. It's good for our class. Like
100%.
Yep.
If anyone remembers Shadowlands, any fight that spawned ads, unless it was specifically like Anduin's ads, we were useless.
Even Anduin wasn't great.
Yeah, like you could Searing Nightmare pad on them technically, but that just wasn't how we worked. We couldn't do damage to them instantly. But now we can just, like, for example, Erenog this tier, everyone knows they evaporate those ads and they aren't real. Yeah. But say there was a fight that had ads like that with maybe a tiny bit more HP that were relevant, we can just throw Shadow Crash, we can Void Torrent the boss, or even a big man in the pack, like there's a big captain guy that spawns with Erenog, and we would do significant burst AoE that is an extremely useful thing to have, and we haven't ever had. We haven't had.
I mean, Dathia and Senarth are pretty good examples, right? Like, obviously this really depends on like mostly like a prog conversation, I guess, versus like a pad conversation. But yeah, and yes, we have more of those. Obviously, we're giving up some single target now to do it, but for a 2-point investment, that's not bad. That's really not bad. That's actually is a good point. I did want to bring up is that, we're doing all of this work for these AoE builds, but the nice part is they're not really losing much in single target, which is really good. And kind of part of the whole point, right? Is like we now have that burst AoE or more AoE options in general without giving up too much single target, right? Which is always important.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, without doing anything weird, if you just swap 2 points of DE from a raid build into PL for these fights like Dathia, if you were playing like a full single target Voidrun build, which is what we used to recommend, I think it changed to Void Eruption because it lined up better with wins.
Sure.
You could just swap those points from DE to PL as it stands right now. You lose, I think it's about 4% single target, and you would gain the ability to go to a platform, throw Shadow Crash, press DA, press Torrent, and you would kill all of them.
You win.
Not quite kill by yourself, but you'll be useful.
Good. Yeah. So it is kind of fun. I mean, like, the changes came at a good time for like anyone like me that's still progressing through Mythic, but obviously, wish that we got some of these before the tier started for a lot of us. But fingers crossed that I think like at least the ideas that they're working with and kind of these patterns still stay intact for the next year. And if they do, like, no reason I don't think we'll see lots of shadows even in the race. So it should be fun. Okay, so we've been going for a bit over an hour and 20. Any kind of final topics or last thing you guys want to cover?
Play Mindset.
Yeah, hashtag play Mindset.
It's getting better next week.
Awesome. Well,
I guess the thing about AoE is people might be baited to press Devouring Plague to buff Void Torrent with Mastery, stuff like that. It's not worth it. Press Mindset. I checked. You don't buff them with the Devouring Plague.
There you go.
But another thing is, if you're worried about like pressing Mindset versus pressing Devouring Plague, and you don't have anything else to press, just press Devouring Plague and move. It's fine.
Yeah,
it really is fine.
I mean, that is the good point. The whole reason this is even a conversation is that it is kind of close, or like it's surprisingly close, I guess is kind of how I would put it. But yeah. Okay, so yeah, a lot of the stuff that we talked about today, especially like the new stuff for 10.05, my plan is to get as much of it out for folks tomorrow. So look forward to that. If you want to see kind of any of the details about either how to run the sims or kind of new talent builds for 10.05, my goal is to put that out for you guys tomorrow. Just a quick note before I do this, and I know people are going to say this tomorrow, it's going to bug the crap out of me. We will give you new talent strings tomorrow. They will not work in live. They will not work in Wowhead's talent calculator until PTR and the build actually goes live. If you guys have old talent strings, they don't work anymore with the new patch. You have to regenerate them. So just a note that that's also changing. But yeah, thanks again, Saeldur, Jaerv, for hanging out with me kind of on a late Sunday night for you guys. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for watching and tuning in. I know some of the ads were kind of interruptive and annoying. I apologize, but the VOD will be up. It's up now if you want to go back and watch anything. And I'll have this up on YouTube for anyone that missed any of it and you want to see it there. So thanks again for supporting us, the Discord, and everything. Really appreciate it, guys. And
give us movement.
Yep.
Give us Volt.
That's all I have for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you next time. Bye.